Now that we have kind of a general idea of what a cell is, I want to talk about the characteristics and features that are common to all cells. Now I want to remind you that earlier in the semester we briefly talked about different types of cells called prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Prokaryotic cells, like the ones that you see in this slide here, bacteria cells are one example of them, remember, are cells that do not contain a nucleus. They still contain DNA, it's just that that DNA is not contained within a separate space or organelle inside the cell called a nucleus. Now, as it turns out, prokaryotic cells have some features and structures to them that are unique that we do not find in eukaryotic cells, and eukaryotic cells have some features to them we do not find in prokaryotic cells. So by looking at each of these individually, we're going to be able to see what makes each different from the other. So you all remember again, prokaryotic cells, pro means before, karyo means kernel, eu means true. So prokaryote is a cell that does not have a true nucleus, whereas a eukaryote does have a true nucleus. And you'll remember in our previous discussions that there are kind of two general groups of prokaryotes out there. There are the bacteria, of which most of us are familiar with to some degree or another, and then there are the less familiar archaea. And remember, those are cells similar to bacterial cells, but archaea live in very extreme environments, such as really hot environments, really cold environments, very salty environments, very acidic environments, etc. So let's take a look inside of a bacterial cell and see what all is there. First things first, bacterial cells do not have true organelles. A true organelle is a collection of molecules inside of a cell which is surrounded by its own plasma membrane. Okay, so a true organelle is a collection of molecules inside of a cell that perform a specific function for the cell and which are surrounded by a plasma membrane. So you have the outside plasma membrane of the cell, and then if you have organelles, you also have plasma membranes inside the outer plasma membrane that surround each of the true organelles. So bacterial cells do not have true organelles, so you might ask yourself, well, what all do they have? Well, let's start from the outside of the cell and we'll work our way inward to the interior. And we'll start on the outside with the cell envelope, or the outer covering or container of the cell. And that cell envelope, depending on the type of bacterial species, can have different types of exterior components. A common feature of all bacteria is the presence of this thing called a cell wall. And the cell wall in bacteria is made of a special kind of polysaccharide called peptidoglycan. Peptidoglycan is made primarily of sugars, but it also contains some cross-linking proteins in it as well. And it provides for a really nice rigid structural cell wall that gives support to the cell. Interior to the cell wall, there will always be a plasma membrane. We've learned about plasma membranes before, so I'm not really going to go into much detail on the plasma membranes. Now sometimes the plasma membrane in a bacterial cell, if this is my bacterial cell here, and outside in red, outside in red here is the cell wall, inside in black is the plasma membrane. Sometimes that plasma membrane will actually fold in on itself like you see here, and that infolding or invagination is called a mesosome. And mesosomes are regions where different types of metabolic activities occur, and they also help to increase the overall surface area of the bacterial cell. Another common feature you'll see on bacterial cells, just like you saw in animal cells that we discussed last week, is this presence of a glycocalyx, or a sugar coating, on the outside of the cell. Some bacterial species have a modified glycocalyx that can have a very slimy or thick covering to it, and we call that a capsule. So that's kind of the outside of the cell. Let's move inward through the cell wall, through the plasma membrane, and into the fluid-like interior of the bacterial cell. The fluid-like interior of the bacterial cell is called cytoplasm. By definition, cytoplasm is the fluid inside of the cell plus all of the different particles of molecules floating around in that. Okay. So the cytoplasm of this bacterial cell has the fluid-like component. It also contains something called a nucleoid region. Now you will remember I told you bacterial cells or prokaryotes do not have a nucleus, but what they do have is a region inside of the bacterial cell where the circular chromosome is located. And the circular chromosome, by the way, is always anchored to the plasma membrane. That region where that circular chromosome is located is called the nucleoid region. It also turns out that bacteria have independent little circular fragments of DNA that are separate from circular chromosome called plasmids. And these plasmids can give bacteria all sorts of abilities. Some bacteria have plasmids that make them resistant to penicillin. Other bacteria might have plasmids that make them resistant to erythromycin or another type of antibiotic. And it turns out bacterial cells can actually trade plasmids with one another so that they can impart new abilities onto neighboring bacterial cells. And this has contributed to some degree to our increased antibiotic resistance we see today. Other items inside the bacterial cell are ribosomes. Ribosomes are little collections of RNA and proteins that together function to synthesize protein. In a couple weeks, we're going to learn specifically the process by which ribosomes help synthesize proteins. But for now, you just need to know that ribosomes are these little dot-like structures you see all over inside this cell, and that their purpose is to synthesize proteins. Bacteria also commonly have what are called inclusion bodies. And inclusion bodies are basically locations where we store different nutrients, like you see here. Bacteria are just like us. They will save up nutrients for times when nutrients aren't as readily available. You'll also see thylakoids present in some types of bacteria, for example, in a class of bacteria called cyanobacteria. And thylakoids basically collections of I guess they're kind of like almost like an internal membrane on which molecules of chlorophyll are attached. And chlorophyll is a molecule that traps energy from the sun and stores that energy so that it can be converted into other forms of energy such as glucose molecules. Cyanobacteria, by the way, are bacteria that photosynthesize or have the ability to collect energy from the sun to make sugars. Other parts of a bacterial cell include sometimes appendages on the outside. Sometimes you can have flagella, like this long whip-like structure here. Flagella help bacteria move through their environment. Some have fimbriae, which are these shorter hair-like bristles all over the surface. And sometimes these help bacteria attach to surfaces. And lastly, sometimes you'll even see sex pili, and they don't have one drawn in this picture. Oh, yes, they do. I'm sorry. Yes, they do right here. And sex pili are just simply hollow-like extensions that extend out from some bacterial cells and allow them to attach to another bacterial cell so that they can trade genetic information. Now, just for comparison purposes, I want to touch very briefly on the archaea. Remember again, archaea are also prokaryotes, but they exist in very extreme environments like those of Yellowstone National Park, like you see here, where you have thermal hot pools with boiling water and archaea existing in it. Archaea are much more diverse in terms of the different shapes that they can have. Back here a couple slides ago, you saw a picture that showed you some of the more common shapes of bacteria, and they could include little rod-like structures called bacillus, little round berry-shaped cells called coccus, and then squiggly-like cells that can be called either spirochetes or spirillum depending. By comparison, you can get a lot more different variety in cell shape among archaea. You can see this archaea actually looks almost like it's shaped like a star. Archaea do not have a cell wall that contains peptidoglycan, but what they do have is a cell wall that contains a molecule similar to peptidoglycan called pseudomurine. Not that you need to know that, but their cell wall is not made of peptidoglycan. It's made of something similar, but not quite the same. It has been postulated that the most likely ancestor that gave rise to eukaryotes was not a bacterial cell, but was instead a type of archaea cell. All right, the next round of slides, we're going to be moving on and talking about eukaryotic cells and the pieces and parts of that.